For the past 2 decades, digital technologies have had an increasing important impact on people's lives. Regulators in the EU have often faced challenges when tackling new issues emerging from these developments. Policymakers have taken time to address them. This is the first episode of a Jean Monnet module series, and we shall discuss today the unprecedented economic power of large online platforms and the resulting impact on the digital economy. It's my pleasure to discuss these timely issues today with Sébastien Fassiaux, lecturer at Esade Law School in Barcelona. Sébastien, why are large online platforms such a concern when we talk about companies like Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon or TikTok? What exactly worries regulators?
Well, these companies don't just sell products. They are very important intermediaries. They control key gateways through which businesses reach customers, and they control how people basically access information. So that gives them an enormous influence over markets. Think about Amazon, over public debate, think about social media companies, and also democratic processes and the influence they can have on elections.
Yes, but that being said, big companies have always existed. What makes digital platforms so different?
Digital platforms benefit from what we call network effects. So the more users they have, the more valuable they become. Think about an operating system, which is more valuable when it has more users. It becomes more valuable for app developers. No? That can make markets, these types of markets, tip very quickly toward a small number of very dominant firms. And that creates obviously dependencies both for businesses and consumers.
Against this background, in 2022, the European Union lawmaker, that's the European Parliament and the Council of the Union, adopted the Digital Market Act, or DMA. Can you explain us what this act is about?
Exactly. So the DMA was precisely designed to address the structural power of the largest online platforms, and its focus is to prevent harmful practices. So its goal is to keep digital markets fair and contestable by imposing specific obligations and prohibitions on the most influential platforms.
Yes, but there's something that I don't understand. The European Union law has already a number of competition rules. In particular, EU law prohibits abuse of dominant position. There is plenty of case law regarding the matter since the 1960s. Why on earth the EU lawmaker had to adopt a new regulation to tackle abuse of dominant position?
Well, traditional competition law obviously remains very relevant, but the European Commission takes time in its investigations. It requires to prove abuses on a case-by-case basis, and basically it complicates things over time. The DMA takes a very different approach from traditional competition law because it identifies the gatekeepers beforehand, it identifies the relevant markets, and also it basically imposes clear rules before the problems occur.
So if it occurs to me that the DMA is really about acting before the damage occurs, am I right?
Exactly. And basically, instead of waiting for these very long investigations and the appeals before the courts, the DMA now establishes upfront obligations. That makes the enforcement by the European Commission much faster, more predictable for economic actors, and also more effective in general. So really the focus of the DMA is not to punish anti-competitive behaviors after they occur, but that gatekeepers actually comply before they exclude competitors or before they exploit consumers. It's basically a significant regulatory shift. Under traditional competition law, the European Commission has to prove, after the harm occurs, that there has been an anti-competitive behavior. In sharp contrast, now with the DMA, the new regime allows the European Commission to act before these anti-competitive behaviors take place. Let me give you just an example of how these traditional competition rules were applied before the DMA. For example, if you take the Google shopping case, which is about the self-preferencing of Google's services in its search rankings, the European Commission issued a decision 10 years after the complainant company, which was a UK platform, was demoted in Google search. And basically, that platform, the UK platform, went out of business. It then took 20 years in the end before a final judgment of the Court of Justice was issued.
If I understand you correctly, the 2022 DMA is complementary to the traditional competition law. In other words, it empowers the European Commission, the executive of the European Union, to intervene upstream and not downstream. I imagine that the 2022 DMA doesn't apply to every platform whatsoever. It focuses on so-called gatekeepers. Can you explain us what that term means?
Yes, so gatekeepers are basically platforms that occupy a strategic position between consumers and businesses, and these firms can effectively control access to digital markets. This is why the DMA subjects them to special obligations.
That brings us to a key question. How does the DMA determine whether an undertaking is a gatekeeper?
So the regulation basically establishes different presumptions under which these firms could be designated as gatekeepers. So they look at different factors, for example, the turnover or the market value of these firms, and that allows to presume that the gatekeeper has a significant impact on the internal market. But another presumption or threshold is the number of users also, to presume that these gatekeepers are a significant gateway for business users to reach consumers. And a third one is to look at the core platform services that are being offered by these firms and whether they have a significant and durable position on the market. And there you need to look at the thresholds for the past 3 years. These are quantitative thresholds, but of course they can be challenged and they can be rebutted.
So if I understand correctly, the regulation lays down a number of objective factors, such as turnover, market value, number of users. And it seems to me that the European Commission, so the executive of the EU, must apply these factors in order to determine who is the gatekeeper. Could you be kind enough to give us an example?
Yes, so one of the companies that challenged its designation under the DMA was TikTok.
So TikTok, this Chinese company, challenged the decision to qualify him as a gatekeeper before the administration or before court?
Indeed, TikTok challenged the decision of the European Commission before the General Court of the European Union. Why the General Court? Because it's the court of first instance, which is competent to adjudicate the disputes between firms that are not agreeing with the decisions of the European Commission.
So it occurs to me that TikTok, qualified as a gatekeeper, took the view that the Commission decisions was illegal, and for that reason it challenged that decision before the General Court. What were the arguments put forward by TikTok before the General Court?
Well, TikTok argued that despite its size and popularity, it did actually not enjoy an entrenched and durable position that normally characterizes a gatekeeper. In other words, it claimed that it was still a challenger and a strong competitor against other social media companies like Facebook or Instagram.
And then what did the General Court decide? What were the most important takeaways from this judgment?
The key takeaway from this judgment is basically that the DMA creates a very strong presumption of gatekeeper status. It is very difficult to rebut those presumptions. Companies can challenge the presumption, but the burden is very high, and basically they can be rebutted only in exceptional cases.
Therefore, TikTok was qualified correctly as a gatekeeper within the meaning of the DMA. Is that correct?
Exactly.
I imagine the DMA doesn't regulate the entire digital economy. What kinds of services fall within its scope?
Indeed, it's not only about social media like TikTok. Here the DMA targets what it calls core platform services. And these include, for example, online search engines, but also app stores, operating systems, online marketplaces, cloud services, virtual assistants, and others.
The fact of the matter is that technology evolves quickly, extremely quickly. Services change over time. Has the Commission considered updating that list?
Well, yes, in fact, it's one of the main criticisms of digital regulation, that they become obsolete as technology evolves. But now the DMA includes review mechanisms. What does that mean? That the European Commission must now evaluate periodically whether new services should be included in that category. The Commission must evaluate the DMA every 3 years, and it became applicable in May 2023. So now, in April 2026, the Commission published its first review of the regulation. Basically, it concluded that the DMA was still fit for purpose and that it had a positive impact so far on digital markets. And therefore, it did not deem it necessary to change the list of core platform services.
The question arises as to whether such a regulation is effective. Let's turn to enforcement. In traditional competition law, the European Commission, so the executive of the EU, as well as the national competition authorities are in charge of the enforcement. Who is responsible for making sure gatekeepers comply with the regulation?
Well, here it's the European Commission that is the central enforcer of the DMA. And in particular is DG Competition, which relies on decades of experience in competition enforcement, that is the main actor.
Does it mean that national authorities have any role? Are they sidelined?
No, not entirely. So they cannot independently enforce the DMA against the gatekeepers, but they can and they actually must assist the Commission by conducting investigation, by sharing information, including confidential information with the European Commission.
In other words, national competition authorities are there to support the European Commission, so there must be cooperation between the domestic level and the EU level.
Exactly, but it's the European Commission that really takes the lead here under the DMA.
Roughly speaking, the DMA obliges economic operators to comply with a number of requirements, a number of obligations. Can you give us some concrete examples of what gatekeepers must now do differently than in the past?
Indeed, so the DMA now contains both obligations and prohibitions, quite specific actually. Let me give you just some examples. An example of an obligation is the obligation for messaging apps to become interoperable between themselves. So now, what is the concrete benefit for users? Is that, for example, if you use WhatsApp, which is designated as a gatekeeper under the DMA, there are obligations under the regulations for WhatsApp to become interoperable with other messaging apps, and for users to be able to communicate with users on other apps.
Can you give us another example?
Another example of a prohibition this time is that gatekeepers cannot self-preference their own services. For example, Google cannot favor its own services in its search rankings, as we've discussed before with the Google shopping case. But another prohibition is also for e-commerce platforms, for example, like Amazon. They cannot use the data that is generated by their business users, so third-party sellers on the platform, to compete with them.
The DMA was enacted in 2022, so there is some practice. Can you explain us the manner in which the European Commission is applying these new rules in practice?
Yes, now the European Commission already has some experience in enforcing the rules, and in April 2025 it issued its first non-compliance decisions. Those decisions were against Apple and Meta. And let me comment just the one against Apple. The one against Apple related to its App Store, which was designated as a gatekeeper, as it's an intermediary between developers of apps and users. And those apps are used on the iPhone and iPads, no? And the problem here is that Apple prohibited app developers to inform their users that they could get alternative, usually cheaper offers outside of the App Store. This is explicitly prohibited under the DMA, and so the European Commission found a breach of it and fined the company 500 million euros.
Bluntly speaking, the European Commission is the key enforcer of the DMA regulation. Therefore, the Commission is adopting decisions obliging the gatekeepers to comply with the obligation laid down in the regulation. When a company is told to comply by the European Commission, what does that actually involve?
Well, compliance can be actually legally and technically complex. Gatekeepers are required not only to redesign their services, so for example, giving more choices to users, but also they need to change their business practices. For instance, Amazon needs to share certain data with the sellers on its platform. They need to open technical possibilities, so for example, make the messaging apps interoperable, as we've discussed. And finally, also, they need to modify contractual terms. So for example, Apple now needs to modify its contractual terms for its App Store.
However, there are always the bad guys. There are always undertakings trying to take advantage of loopholes. What are the consequences of non-compliance?
Well, the European Commission can impose important fines of up to 10% of a company's worldwide turnover. And in case of repeated infringements, it can reach even 20% of their turnover. But what can be sometimes more far-reaching is when the Commission imposes behavioral or structural remedies. That means that it can impose on gatekeepers to act in a certain way on the market, or even to divest parts of their businesses. But these are extreme cases.
Well, and fines up to 10% of a company's worldwide turnover. That's something significant. So I imagine that the companies that are fined are challenging the European Commission decision before the General Court.
Yes, they indeed do. But again, here the focus is really not on sanctioning the companies, but rather on compliance.
The EU is actually navigating through troubled waters. It's constantly crossing swords with the USA when it comes to custom duties, technical regulations. I imagine that the DMA has not been welcomed. How has the United States reacted?
No, indeed, and the current Trump administration has strongly criticized the DMA. They argue particularly that the regulation disproportionately affects American tech companies. And they also constantly criticize the DMA for stifling innovation.
But can the Trump administration require the European Union to abrogate the regulation?
No, because at the end of the day, the European Union is sovereign. But it's true that digital regulations in general, not only the DMA, are constantly brought on the table during trade negotiations, for instance.
Roughly speaking, the EU is facing the unprecedented economic power of large online platforms, most of which are Americans, one of which is TikTok, a Chinese company. If listeners remember just one thing about this famous DMA, what should it be?
Well, I think that the most important conclusion about the DMA is that it marks a shift from reacting to abuses of dominance after they occur to proactively shaping digital markets, basically with prohibitions and obligations. And whether or not we support it, it actually marks a really big change in the way that the EU regulates economic power in the digital age.
Thank you very much indeed, Sébastien Fassiaux, for intervening in this series of podcasts dedicated to the digital age. This series is funded by the EU Agencies for Education.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.